In 1933, a Russian cargo ship set out on a historic mission across the Arctic Ocean from northeast Russia in search of a permanent trade route called the Northeast Passage. The ship, like countless others before it, became entangled in the thickening winter ice and spent months dangling in the currents below. Then, in the month of February, the ship's hull let forth a low moan. The skipper immediately ordered the crew to disembark and go out onto the ice. The first voyage of the SS Chelyuskin is recounted here. The Arctic is very important to the Russian people, as it is to the people of other countries that border the northernmost parts of the world. A few Cossacks sailed around northeastern Russia and up the Bering Sea in 1648, marking the beginning of their exploration of the region. This voyage established that the Atlantic Ocean separates Asia and North America, contrary to the popular assumption that the two continents were geographically linked. It was another piece of evidence that a maritime route would be feasible, even though a route over northern Asia, the Northeast Passage, had been postulated for a while. What this indicated, critically, was that a somewhat less circuitous path across the Arctic could be possible, connecting Europe with the Pacific Ocean. The northern Russian coasts were gradually explored for several centuries thereafter by expeditions from a number of nations. However, the lengthy, severe winters and frozen rivers made these endeavors more difficult. When ships became trapped in the ice, they would frequently have to wait months for it to melt before setting sail for the winter. Usia set a number of nationwide ambitious plans and objectives after the 1917 Russian Revolution and under the new Soviet administration, which occurred several centuries later. An enlargement of the Northern Sea route was one of these aims. It was later discovered that Siberia was rich in resources, and this route would make it easier to transport products and people between regions, and eventually across Russia. Unfortunately, this necessitated fording the numerous ice seas that dotted the northern coastlines, as had been the case with earlier investigations and expeditions. Ships equipped with strengthened hulls, shaped to break the ice, were utilized for this purpose. These icebreakers were invented very recently. Around the same time as these icebreakers, aircraft also started to be deployed. Stowing planes on deck and then hoisting them onto improvised runways carved into the ice became the standard procedure. The next step would be for them to fly ahead and find the ship's safest course. The Soviet government began to place greater emphasis on the northern routes at the close of the 1920s, when Russian pilots and ships gained notoriety for their Arctic expeditions. The Soviet authorities then established an Arctic Commission in 1932 to conduct extensive exploration of the area. Otto Schmidt, a math professor at Moscow State University, an accomplished geographer, and the president of the state publishing company for scientific books, presided over this commission. The Arctic archipelago of Franz Josef Land was the site of multiple trips he led to set up a research station. He was also an accomplished mountaineer. Like his love of mountaineering, Otto's love of the Arctic developed during these journeys. Later that year, Otto was assigned the unprecedented job of completing the Northern Sea route in a single season. He was to board a ship along the coast of Murmansk in the northwest, sail across Russia, and finally make his way north of Japan via the Bering Strait, according to this scheme. Despite the propeller shaft breaking midway through the expedition, Otto was able to complete the trip successfully using an icebreaker. Amazingly, the group completed the last stage of the voyage with the help of an improvised sail. This demonstrated the route's practicability to the Soviet administration. The remaining issue, though, was that the majority of icebreakers were either too small to transport much freight or weren't designed for long-distance travel. Therefore, while a route might be theoretically feasible, it might not achieve the objective of creating an appropriate commerce route. This meant that Otto would have to undertake the voyage again in 1933, but with a different cargo ship, the SS Chelyuskin. The Chelyuskin outshone most cargo ships due to its recent construction and superior strength. The term semi-icebreaker was even used by Otto. We reinforced and custom-built the hull. Its accommodations were designed to endure freezing temperatures in the event that it were trapped during the winter, and its power was twice that of a typical cargo ship. It was also never meant to undertake an expedition as difficult as a lengthy Arctic voyage. Even while it was powerful, it lacked the horsepower of a real icebreaker and couldn't cut through thick ice. However, considering the circumstances, it was the optimal choice for this second crossing. Otto was accompanied by the same captain from the previous year, From what is now St. Petersburg, Russia, formerly known as Leningrad, the ship formally set sail on July 12, 1933. Calibration of the new ship's engines was done en route to Copenhagen, which they reached on the 16th. As a final port of call before crossing, the ship sailed past Copenhagen and on to Murmansk. At long last, they left Murmansk on August 10th to embark on their Arctic voyage. Ships passing across northern Russia must navigate 6 distinct seas. First, we sailed over the Barents Sea, which was completely clear of ice. The warm North Atlantic current keeps it at a constant temperature, making it the safest option among these. Following that, the Kara Sea wasn't very lenient. The initial impact with the ice caused the Chelyuskin's stern plates to bend inward, which cracked a portion of the hull. Even if it wasn't enough to cancel the trip, the news wasn't good either, especially because the ice was only going to worsen. Fortunately, good news followed this dreadful news very soon. One of the 4 women on board gave birth to a daughter just before the ship arrived at a place called Cape Chelyuskin. Her name was Karina. 11 ships, including the Chelyuskin, reached the Cape that year in September, approximately 1 month later. The Soviet leadership's obsession with opening the channel was evident in the fact that only 9 ships had ever used it prior to 1933. Furthermore, every single ship that year had served as an icebreaker. So, the Chelyuskin had accomplished an amazing feat in spite of the damage she had sustained in the Kara Sea. Both the Laptov and East Siberian seas were 90 to 100% ice-covered when the ship sailed past the Cape. The good news was that the ice was thin enough for the Chelyuskin to push through, and any damage was modest enough to be remedied because it was still fall. However, when they arrived in the Chukchi Sea, the final leg before entering the Bering Strait, things took a turn for the worse. At this very spot, the ship's engine had failed during the last expedition, and the ice was significantly thicker this time. Even though their pace was decreasing, the Chelyuskin persisted in pushing through the ice for some time. Unfortunately, they did manage to get within 16 miles of an area with open water, but by that point, it was already too late. The Chelyuskin came to a stop on September 21st. Officially, the ship was ensnared in the ice, and its rudder was twisted by 20 degrees. A bay to the northeast of the Bering Strait was the only destination the boat could reach as it drifted east with the ice. Sea currents force ice flows into that bay, deep within the continent, where they are crushed and compacted. They couldn't use their jet or deliver aid by air because it was in a whiteout-prone location. With no other choice, the staff had to wait for better weather and shift their attention to other tasks. Then, on October 1st, slightly more than 7 days later, Otto perceived an ominous noise. Through the whiteout, he could make out the sound of barking and wailing dogs. The sound was low at first, but it gradually increased in volume until, out of the fog, came dog sleds. The indigenous Chukchi people had arrived. Someone had apparently seen the stranded ship, so they sent out a rescue party and traveled 25 kilometers on a dog sled to reach it. After that, Otto requested that a crew member who was fluent in their language accompany him to the shore. The Chukchi extended an invitation to bring as many individuals as they could across the Bering Strait to a moored icebreaker called the Litka. There were over 100 people on the team, but they could only fit a small fraction of them on the few dog sleds available. With winter on the horizon, the route also included more than 330 kilometers across snowy Siberia. This led Otto to decide to return 6 men to their employment in the event of a shipwreck, while sending 1 man who was critically ill and required urgent medical treatment. Following the Chukchi's departure, Otto started making plans to construct a base in the adjacent ice to endure the harsh winter. However, on October 5th, the wind shifted, cracking the ice where they had set up camp. The men working outside barely had time to scramble on board with their tools before the water re-encircled the ship. Once again, the Chelyuskin was moving, and it was wonderful. Even better, they had managed to fix the rudder while it was wedged in just a few days ago. The spirits of the crew instantly rose, and a wave of relief swept across the vessel. But their hope was short-lived. A few hours later, the ice regained control. From here on out, the ice and the water currents below would be their only companions. Trapped at the mouth of the Bering Strait, the Chelyuskin drifted in circles for over a month. No one on board knew how or where they could escape. On November 3rd, the ice that had confined them floated into the strait. But still, they couldn't break free. Time and again, they drifted south past the Diomede Islands, marking the midpoint between Russia and Alaska, only to be forced northward again by the powerful Pacific Current. Otto grew increasingly anxious as the ship moved farther north each time. The risk of being dragged deep into the Arctic's interior increased, making it nearly impossible for them to escape within the year. Worse yet, the ice's crushing weight was threatening the ship's stability. Otto had reached out to the Litka before, but they had their own problems. Their engines weren't running at full power, making icebreaking extremely difficult, if not impossible. Still, as the situation on the Chelyuskin worsened, Otto sent a desperate message to the Litka on November 10th, pleading for assistance. He knew it put them in danger, but he had no other choice. Despite the risks, the Litka's captain was determined to help. His first attempt to breach the ice immediately failed. The Litka simply lacked the power. Next, they tried to navigate around the ice sheet to get closer to the Chelyuskin, but that too was unsuccessful. Things went from bad to worse. The ice was growing thicker, wider. The Litka's captain then proposed anchoring near the ice's edge so the Chelyuskin's crew could cross on foot. But by that point, they were already 50 kilometers apart. It was too risky. Otto couldn't take the chance. There was also the possibility of flying passengers over, but when the plane attempted takeoff, it crashed into the ice, rendering it unusable. They had exhausted every option. Otto felt terrible as he pleaded with the Litka to stop trying. Meanwhile, the ice floe beneath them moved erratically, sometimes drifting west, sometimes east. For a time, it seemed to pause near the Chukchi Sea coast. Then, in December, the ice finally softened just enough for them to make another move. But almost immediately, they were stranded again. And then, the sun set for good. During the long Arctic night, they would endure months of darkness. Amazingly, this was one of their lesser concerns. Otto and his crew had never imagined they would spend the entire winter aboard the ship, trying to map out an escape. Their coal supply hadn't been meant to last so long. Now, they were burning through it at an alarming rate just to keep warm. If they weren't careful, they would run out entirely. The responsibility of rationing coal fell to the first-class mechanic on board. First, the engine stokers who reduced coal consumption were rewarded with bonuses. Then, he attempted shutting off the heat for 8 hours a day, but this made the walls damp with condensation. So he adjusted the strategy, turning off the heater for a maximum of 2 hours per day. Then, he combined other types of oil, crude, waste, paraffin, animal fats, and whatever else was on hand, to create a new kind of fuel. Despite a decrease in coal consumption, this was sufficient to heat vital sectors. However, the reliability of their coal supply was an ongoing worry. Water became the subsequent issue that winter. They had exhausted their water supply by the end of November. They had no choice but to start melting ice for food and shelter by late December. A number of crew members were tasked with collecting ice and returning it to the boiler for melting. However, the team started to adapt to their new life as they discovered ways to solve their most pressing issues, and time went on. Interestingly, there were even those who discovered enjoyable moments. In order to find good places for planes to land, the crew utilized the skis they brought with them. They found rocky outcroppings to leap out of while skiing leisurely in their break. A few of the crew members went so far as to use flags to plot a racing course around the ship. Hunting contests were also a part of their activities. Evenings were spent listening to Otto lecture on cutting-edge scientific theories, with everyone who brought an instrument then getting a chance to sing and play. They had sunk to the center of the Chukchi Sea by February 1934. The ice was getting thicker and heavier as the winter progressed. It seemed to Otto like the ship might run into difficulties eventually. Because the ice was jolting the ship more than usual, the engineer sent a crew to examine the hull on February 12th. There was still a little window of light during the Arctic winter that wasn't quite black, despite the fact that there were 24 hours of darkness. In the midst of this 40-degree blizzard, the crew members climbed down from the ship and carefully examined the hull for signs of damage. Thankfully, they didn't come across any, but they did see a fissure in the ice on the ship's front right side. This may have appeared to be wonderful news, but the engineer realized that it meant the enormous ice sheets were moving, meaning the Chelyuskin's hull would soon be under much greater pressure. Shocks started to rattle the ship the next day, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The ice fissure became wider, and the strain on the ship rose 20 minutes after that. Initially, the Chelyuskin was repelled as far as it could by the ice, but when space became scarce, the ship got firmly lodged. After that, the ship started to be crushed by the ice, which caused the engine room and a few bunkers on the right side to collapse. The upper deck's plates inflated and eventually burst due to the strong jolts that tossed the crew around. The Chelyuskin began to lean to one side. There was a small respite from the chaos, but Otto sensed that the worst was yet to come. He had already instructed the storage of emergency supplies on deck in the event that such an occurrence were to happen. His next order was for the crew to transfer everything to the ice. Laying planks over the sides of the ship, they slipped goods down before hauling them to a tent they had built up days previously, taking advantage of the ship's leftward lean. After ensuring the safety of the supplies, Otto granted the crew a brief 5-minute window to collect their own possessions. Another strong tremor jolted the vessel 15 minutes after the initial hit. Small jolts were followed by the collapse of another part of the hull. A rapid inundation of various compartments ensued as water exploded through the hull. Water poured over the bow as the ship's added weight dragged it down. Amidst all the mayhem, the crew managed to send out one more radio message before removing the radio gear and leaving the ship. In a mad dash, Otto, the captain, and a dozen crew members threw anything usable overboard as they ordered all but vital individuals onto the ice. In their haste to regain control of the ship, the animals they had brought aboard bolted in all directions. They killed them because they had no other alternative, then dumped their bodies overboard to consume later. The ship's pitch increased as water continued to pour into the cabins below. The crew bolted as the skipper yelled out orders to join the ice. Just as Otto and the captain were about to reach the gangway, a portion of the upper deck gave way beneath them. As the captain was stepping down the gangway stairs, a plank broke and sent him tumbling onto the ice. Everyone else on board hurriedly jumped off, disregarding the height of the sides. Only the quartermaster remained. Just as he started to climb over the side of the ship, the Chelyuskin capsized, sending the engine and rudder flying into the air. He had sprinted to the edge of the ship. He was rendered unconscious as the upper deck's barrels, supplies, and debris crashed down upon him. Just a few seconds after that, the Chelyuskin sank under the waves, taking the quartermaster with it. Only in disbelief could the crew watch. They were shaken, scared, and bewildered after witnessing this terrible scenario. Otto reasoned that they should pitch the living tents after setting up the radio tent, eat dinner, and then get some sleep. They awoke on the morning of February 14th and evaluated their condition, having followed this plan. The government's top priority was to arrange for the air evacuation of as many people as could be safely transported by plane, with additional resources, like dog sleds and planes, to help those who couldn't make it. Only Cape Vancurum, 80 miles, 130 kilometers inland, offered any kind of relief to the beleaguered crew. At least according to the plan, they would next be sent to Alaska and then back to Russia via Berlin and London. Creating an ice airport for planes to land on was their first order of business to facilitate this rescue. As they pooled their limited resources to ensure a safe landing, this became the camp's primary objective. Keeping the airstrip in good repair was an ongoing struggle, as they anticipated being stranded for months before a thorough rescue could be carried out. Actually, 13 times the runway broke due to the ice's movement. Each time, the crew had to fix the damage or move their entire base. The rescue operation was being planned by Otto, who also decided who would be flown out and who would have to use a dog sled. Up until that point, their only option was to wait it out and focus on preserving the airstrip. The makeshift settlement was called Camp Schmidt. The risk of flying to Camp Schmidt was about equal to that of taking the northern sea route, unfortunately. Pilot Sigismund Levanevsky learned of the tragedy while tuning into his radio on February 14th, the day following the sinking of the Chelyuskin. Being a famous and esteemed pilot, Levanevsky had a sneaking suspicion that planes would be involved in the rescue operation. In an instant, he offered his skills by telegraph to Moscow. He received notification that he would be participating in a unique operation the next morning. Their chosen departure point in Alaska was among the details shared with Levanevsky during the briefing on the rescue effort. Thankfully, this occurred before World War II, so the United States was kind enough to give the Soviet Union a couple of planes to help with the rescue. Time was of the essence. Thus, a coordinated effort was undertaken swiftly. The ice would start to melt in the spring if they procrastinated, rendering landings impossible for planes. Georgy Ushakov, a seasoned Arctic explorer, and Levanevsky were dispatched to Fairbanks, Alaska, to assist with rescue coordination. All was set up by March 26th, with an initial objective of flying 800 kilometers, 500 miles, to the Alaskan town of Nome, across the Bering Strait. Levanevsky embarked on the mission's inaugural flight. The plane seemed to be held back by the wind as its speed started to diminish halfway through the voyage. In order to inquire about the weather, Levanevsky radioed ahead. A blizzard was brewing up ahead, rendering further travel unsafe, and the response was swift. They had to turn around and wait for the weather to improve because there was no other way forward. The following day, they made another attempt. On this occasion, though, the weather station was malfunctioning, leaving them in the dark about the future. They were running out of time to wait, as the ice was getting thinner daily. While the journey began without a hitch, Levanevsky was forced to fly low as the blizzard intensified. The clouds were so thick that he could only be guided to the landing strip in Nome by the sight of telegraph poles. Somehow, he was able to safely bring the jet down. Cape Vankarum, located on Russia's furthest eastern tip, was the destination of the subsequent flight across the Bering Strait. The following day, the planes took off, and everything appeared to be going according to plan, thanks to the operational weather stations. It was all going smoothly until they reached the Chukchi Peninsula, after which they proceeded to follow the Russian shoreline across the strait. Almost immediately after that, visibility plummeted. After searching for a safe landing location below, Sigismund Levanevsky, Sigi, returned to 5,000 feet and relied on his compass and gut instincts to guide him. A full snowstorm ensued as the clouds grew thicker. Sigi quickly saw a thin layer of ice developing on the plane's glass due to the intense shaking. At nearly the same moment, Georgy Ushakov presented him with a message. The whole aircraft was encased in ice. As Sigi tried to ascend above the storm, the air got increasingly colder, exacerbating the ice accumulation. The plane's weight made it difficult to steer, and the engines started to backfire shortly after. In due time, every instrument became motionless. Sigi was now completely oblivious to his own speed and altitude. To avoid the mountainous terrain, he cautiously adjusted the trajectory, but he knew they would eventually have to land. As they descended further, Sigi spotted what appeared to be solid earth. He steered the jet toward the shore, hoping to find flat ice floes to land on. He desperately yanked back on the controls right before impact to avoid a nose-first collision. There was an ear-piercing screech as metal scraped across the ice. Next thing you know, nightfall. Georgy frantically shook Sigi to see if he was alive as he regained consciousness. Seeing the deep cut on Sigi's head, Georgy wasted no time in bandaging it. His familiarity with the Arctic and its survival techniques would be crucial in the next hours. By sheer luck, the crash site was the very same harbor where the Chelyuskin had become stuck months before. The native Chukchi people provided them with a safe haven. The following day, they made arrangements to be transported to Cape Vankarum by dog sled. At the same time, other pilots who attempted the same flight had more success. While Sigi and Georgy were on their sled journey, another pilot, using an American-supplied jet, reached a neighboring village without incident. Unfortunately, the weather window for flights was short-lived, as storms delayed additional flights until April 7th. The pilots resumed their mission once the weather cleared. Now that Georgy had arrived at Cape Vankarum, he oversaw the subsequent flying wave. For the crew members traveling overland, he had one plane drop supplies and pick up 8 dogs and a sled as soon as it landed. The plane wasted no time getting going for Camp Schmidt, and it only took a few hours to reach the frozen airstrip. Having removed the sled and dogs, the pilot repaired his plane and returned to Cape Vankarum with a new cargo of passengers. A successful air evacuation had never been attempted before. For the following few weeks, Sigi and the other 6 pilots kept making the round trip between Vankarum and the temporary runway. As April came to a close, 55 individuals had been safely airlifted. The rest of the group finished the trip, pulling a dog sled. Despite being trapped on the ice for 8 months, miraculously, only the quartermaster, who had drowned with the Chelyuskin, died. After the survivors were rescued, the Soviet Union bestowed the title of Hero of the Soviet Union onto the pilots. Even the Soviet leadership considered the mission a success. They had crossed the Bering Strait, collected useful data on the Arctic, and improved their cargo ships based on their experiences. The Northern Sea Route officially started shipping in 1935. Even with today's icebreakers and the Arctic warming, the Northern Sea Route is still not dependable. The absence of infrastructure, constant ice shifts, and harsh weather conditions make it one of the world's most treacherous marine routes. The wreckage of a ship was found in 2006, 50 meters beneath the surface of the Chukchi Sea. After further examination, it was determined that the pieces belonged to the Chelyuskin,